So I'd like to welcome everybody to today's walk. Every stone tells a story, and this one is called Murder, Illness, and Accident. And so some of these stories go way back in the community's history. Some are a little more recent. So I did develop this walk with a grant from the St. John Community Arts Board. And this walk was adapted from an historical walk that I did in the Sharazadic Cemetery last summer as part of the Walks and Talks program coordinated by David Goss. And so this is the first slide, but Jewish tradition holds that when lives are cut short as the result of natural causes or unforeseen events, death is not seen as a tragedy, but as a cycle of part of the cycle of life. And it is believed that all life events happen for a reason, even though the circumstances surrounding death may be difficult for those left behind. These lives are celebrated once the official grieving period has passed. So some of the stories are being shared of people who have been forgotten, but we'll remember those who died young, or in some cases not so young, from illness, accident, and murder. And I go back and forth between the different things. So I started the walk in the children's section of the cemetery, or in the back corner. And there are over 950 interments in the cemetery, and about 175 of those were children aged up to about a year of age. So some of the babies were stillborn, or lived only a few days, weeks, or months after their birth. And this plot was designated as plot 3164, although there are children buried elsewhere. And only about 24 of the children's graves are actually marked with stones, including the 3 that you see here. And less than a dozen of them are remembered with a newspaper obituary. But some of the names, family names found in this section of the cemetery include Ashkins, Babb, Begg, Bernstein, Block, Budovich, Cohen, Columbus, Daniel, Ellman, Epstein, Friedman, Garson, Goldfeather, Gus, Hoffman, Jacobson, Levine, Michelson, Perchinock, Rubin, Seelig, Silver, Smith, Swetsky, Tansman, Weber, and Zatzman. So the little stones that you see here, we've learned from some of the records that Susan Daniel was born with a heart condition. Lori Nan Goldfeather was only 7 months old. And Milton Isaacson was 5, and he was actually brought to St. John from Woodstock. I'm not sure, maybe some of the others here. Was another child who died in 1942, Stanley Robert Cohen, who was only 11 weeks old, and they seem to have had some family connections to Moncton. And the death certificate at the Provincial Archives lists his cause of death as toxemic convulsions related to a seasonal epidemic, and it was also impacted by dehydration. Let's see. There was also a Mr. and Mrs. Rosenfeld, and her maiden name is Ruby Basson, and they had a stillborn daughter. This is a name that might be familiar. Sheila Faye Sandler. She died at the age of 3 months. Her parents were Nathan Sandler and Sophie Zatzman, and she left behind parents and a brother. And when I went into the death certificates, I discovered that Sheila Faye Sandler had a twin sister who had died at birth on April the 28th, 1943. Let's see. There's another one that's kind of interesting, Leah Coven, who died on April the 18th, 1946, who died suddenly, but she was from the Coven family in West St. John, Sydney and Marjorie Coven. And Muriel Evelyn Green, whose stone's here in the center, was the daughter of Harry and Dora Green, and she died in 1933 after a lingering illness at the age of 7 years. And her illness was described as tuberculous meningitis. And Wiegensberg, whose stone's here at the right, He died in hospital in February of 1940, and they lived on Wright Street. And their son died in the general hospital after a brief illness at the age of 8. He was a grade 2 student at Winter Street School and was described as a boy of bright disposition, well liked by his playmates. He had 2 sisters, Anita and May, and 2 brothers, Edward and Frank. And his death was recorded as the result of a ruptured spleen. And there's some lack of clarity in the certificate suggesting that he may have experienced some sort of an accident that resulted in that, whether he fell or was hit by something, I'm not quite sure. We also have a death in 1919 of an Ada Addis. She fell from the back seat of her father's car while they were driving in Moncton. So I guess this is why we may now have seatbelts in our car. And in 1913, November the 10th, there was a headline in the St. John newspaper in the Daily Telegraph, and it read, "Boy falls in tub of boiling water and is badly scalded." And this little boy's name was Samuel Dritz. He lived on Chapel Street, and he was burned around the neck and the shoulders after he fell backward into the tub of wash water that had been set out by his mother. Dr. Broderick attended to the injuries, and they thought at first that everything would be fine, but he did die of those injuries. And another boy in February of 1923 was found under the headline, "Jury Visits Scene of Tragic Death of Samuel Milber." And the coroner's jury was appointed to hold an inquest into the death of this 8-year-old boy who was killed on a Tuesday afternoon by a transfer train at the Acadia Street crossing. And they listed who the jurors were, that the jurors had gone to Bernan's funeral home to view the body, and had also gone to the scene of the accident where there were still traces left of what had happened. And the impression that the jurors had was that somehow this boy had caught his foot in the tracks, and the train went over him and then dragged him until they were able to stop. He may have been sledding on the snow at the time. So we'll leave the children, because there were also mothers who died in childbirth, and I did find 2 of them. And I wrote in my notes that childbirth in the 19th and 20th century, and 21st, of course, still is an event to be celebrated, but in those earlier days often ended in tragedy. Lacking all of the medical resources available today, many children died at birth or shortly afterwards, and sometimes the mothers died with them. So Nettie Dreskin, I was the first wife of Abraham Dreskin. He was the founder, of course, of Dreskin's. And she died on the 14th of June, 1913. She was only 26 years old, and she had just given birth to her 3rd child, Nathan. She'd already had a son, Oscar, who was aged 5, and a daughter, Belle, who became Belle Hamburg, who was only 3, and they were left without their mother. Abraham Dreskin remarried 2 years later. Somebody had fixed him up with another lady in the community, so he had someone to help raise his children. The other mother that I found was Bertha Levine, the wife of Meyer Levine, and she died in July of 1933. And the infant son that she had just had died with her. And so Bertha Levine had been born into the Zeberman family and had only been married not even for a year at the time of her death. She had been employed at Hoffman's Brothers on Main Street, and she was survived by her husband, her mother, 6 sisters, and 4 brothers. And we have another stone here. There's no gravestone for this fellow, but this was a recent immigrant to the city who died in an industrial accident on the 9th of May in 1906. He was only 17 years old. His name was Hyman Eisenstein, and he had just come from Warsaw. And he was working in David Ashkin's clothing factory on Dock Street. And he was killed in an accident in the building's elevator. And As it turned out, the elevator platform where the accident took place would by no means meet today's standards for safety. The platform had a chain only on one side. There was a permanent railing on the opposite side and two sides that were left completely open. And the newspaper reports described how he was caught between the floor of the elevator platform and the floor of the factory. And they think he got trapped somehow when he was pulling the ropes that moved the elevator up and down. So it would have had a counterweight to lower to allow the platform to go up. And he was supposed to have been moving wood at the time, but was tragically killed. They did describe, jury gave a verdict of accidental death, and they did make note that the elevator was not up to date and did make the recommendation to install barricades on all four sides using either bars or chains. And Hyman Eisenstein had a father and a sister who were still living in Russia at the time. So I would guess that his plans to bring them to Canada probably ended at that point. Good. So there were others. So we have two stones here from the Koshetsky family. So Esther Marilyn Koshetsky, who's shown here at the left, was only 27 years old when she died. And the obituary published in the Telegraph Journal on June the 8th of 1973 wrote this: at the St. John General Hospital on June the 7th, 1973, Miss Esther M. Koshetsky of 185 Rockland Road, daughter of Blanche Koshetsky and the late Max Koshetsky, survived by her mother, four brothers, several aunts and uncles, resting at the Calvin Funeral Home at 91 Leinster Street, so here, where I am, where the funeral will be held Friday with service at 3 p.m. And her four brothers were, of course, Jerome, Herzl, Ansel, and Joseph, who is buried beside her. And Joe Koshetsky died in 1974 on November the 4th at the age of 33. And part of the account in the newspaper reads, Mr. Koshetsky, who for the past 4 years lived in Fredericton, where he was a director and part owner of the Castle Galleries of 546 King Street, was featured in several showings through the Maritimes and Canada. One of his works is currently included in a nationwide exhibition being shown by the public in the public Burnaby, BC Gallery. Called Mystic Circle, it will be featured at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in Fredericton sometime during the next year. He was the recipient of 2 Canada Council grants in 1967 and 1968. He specialized in abstracts, but was well known for his versatility of mediums, including objects, watercolors, and small sculptures. In 1972, his originality drew national attention when he put on a one-man show of the painted t-shirts and sweatshirts, which was organized by the Beaverbrook Art Gallery for the Atlantic Provinces Art Circle. The fully wearable shirts featured everything from aspects of the cosmos characterized by geometric shapes to representations of Laurel and Hardy and Greta Garbo. That show was the second to be chosen for the tour. And in 1969, the New Brunswick Museum organized an exhibit of his paintings and drawings that was shown throughout the region. In 1970, he gave one-man shows at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, the University of New Brunswick in St. John, and Zwickers Art Gallery in Halifax. In 1968, one of his first one-man shows was exhibited at the Morrison Art Gallery in St. John. His works were included in the permanent collections of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, the New Brunswick Museum, and the University of New Brunswick. Prior to becoming a full-time working artist, he was employed as a graphic artist with CHSJ Television for approximately 5 years. During that period, he became known as Uncle Joey of a Saturday morning children's story hour called Toon Time, where he illustrated the stories for the children before the cameras. So doing the drawings as someone else was reading the story. And he had been a student of Ted Campbell and Fred Ross when he was a student at vocational school. So that is his story. So I do have one photograph of Joe Koshetsky, which appeared on the front of one of the art programs, art shows that was published after his death. Now, I did mention that there were 3 murder victims in the cemetery, and this is the first of the 3. And Aaron Cohen had come to St. John from Bath, New Brunswick to ensure his children had ties to a Jewish community. And he owned a dry goods shop at 203-205 Prince Edward Street. And the family included his wife, Leah, his son, Benjamin, and their 4 daughters, Sarah, Jenny, Libby, and Minna. And the family lived in the flat above the store. What started as a robbery on the night of Friday, December the 17th, 1937, just before closing time, ended in murder when Mr. Cohen chose to pursue the thief into the street. His wife was out for the evening with friends. His son, Ben, was at the theater with his friends. One daughter was studying nursing at the General Hospital, so would have been living in the residence there. And the youngest daughter, Minna, was upstairs in the family home. The Jewish community was left in shock as a result, although plans for a bar mitzvah went ahead at the Sabbath services conducted the next morning. And this would have been the bar mitzvah for Lou Friedman. This was reported to have been the first murder in St. John for 13 years. As a result, extensive coverage was given to the police investigation, the coroner's inquest, which was covered from December 23rd and 27th, the trial itself from January the 4th to the 18th, 1938, and the appeal that was launched by the defense team that was covered on March the 18th and 19th. Coverage of the event began in the Saturday editions of the newspaper on the morning after the murder and continued almost without missing a day until the verdict of murder was delivered on January the 18th, 1938. The newspaper coverage of the murder, the investigation, and the trial was at times speculative, lurid, and dramatic. Reporters carrying bylines included Ian Sklanders, J.B. Mooney, and even Nathan Druskin, who was, of course, a member of the Jewish community. Detective Inspector Patrick Biddiscombe and Police Chief Slater quickly started a search for the robber, killer, and gathered numerous witnesses, many of whom appeared during the trial, and there were 52 witnesses called by the Crown. Just after Christmas Day, charges were laid against William Robichaud, a 24-year-old unemployed man. Robichaud had entered Cohen's store at 203 Prince Edward Street. This is the murder scene. Shortly after 11 p.m. with the intent to rob the store. He distracted Cohen by trying on a pair of boots and then ordered Cohen to go to the counter. When Cohen balked, Robichaud fired a warning shot, and the shot grazed Cohen's side. At this point, Robichaud began to leave the store while still wearing the new boots, and Cohen gave chase and caught him on the sidewalk outside, where Robichaud had slipped on the ice and fallen. Cohen had Robichaud by the neck, and as stated by the Crown lawyers in their closing arguments, was well within his rights to catch the man who was stealing the boots from him. Robichaud then pulled his revolver from his pocket, aimed it over his right shoulder, and once again fired, this time shooting Cohen in the face. And this would prove to be the fatal shot. Cohen dropped the thief, who then ran across the street, jumped over a fence, dropped into the vacant lot below, and ran away. The newspaper coverage in the trial covered the stories of people who were either on the street at the time, in their homes nearby, or soon on the scene of the events, and each of them described a man who looked like Robichaud. He had been seen in the area earlier, planning when he could rob the store. As for the gun, Robichaud gave it to his girlfriend, Frances Ward. She hid the gun and the bullets, first at home, and then went out the Loch Lomond Road with Louis Frattor, an Italian immigrant, to hide the gun under a fallen tree. The gun was later retrieved by police, and after examination by a ballistics expert from Montreal, was proved to be the gun used in the fatal shooting. The defense team called no witnesses. On the evening of January the 18th, 1938, Robichaud was found guilty of murder by the jury after 2 hours and 15 minutes of deliberation, and he was sentenced by Justice Fairweather to hang on April the 20th. The jury had also brought forward a recommendation for mercy. William Robichaud was sent to the St. John County Jail, where he was placed in a cell separate from other prisoners and without visitors, to await his date with the hangman. His legal team launched an appeal of his sentence. There was extensive verbatim coverage of the appeal in the newspapers of March the 17th, 1938, and the appeal failed. On April the 7th, 1938, his sentence was changed to life in prison, and he was moved to Dorchester Penitentiary a few days later. Petitions were sent from his mother, who had collected 1,000 signatures in support of her son, and another from the jurors who felt that Robichaud had not been treated fairly. And through all of this, there's no word on what the Jewish community is thinking of all of this activity. Mrs. Leah Cohen knew that no conviction would bring her husband back. She did have great talents as a baker, and she supported herself and her family by baking for the Jewish community and for special events. Her son Ben ran the store for a few years after his father's death, but not having his gift for running a store, sold the business and embarked on a career as a bookkeeper. Now, I did do a little bit more research after I finished the formal notes and discovered that Robishaw's last known location was on Grand Banana Island at the time of his mother's death on the 12th of July in 1968. And Charlotte, or Lottie Robichaud, as his mother was called, is buried in Fern Hill Cemetery. And on the night that I gave this walk, one of the people that was at the walk, and I haven't followed this up yet, said that the Cohen case had set a legal precedent on the overturning of death sentences. So I still have to explore that a little bit more. I just have to remember who it was that told me that and find out how to get a hold of her. So there may be more on this story at a later time. But I did take some pieces from the newspaper so you can get a sense of the inside of the store and the Prince Edward Street area. So I think this is the fence that Robichaud jumped over. And they've also included a diagram of the murder scene, and they also included a photograph of the funeral cortege heading out to the cemetery. So if we move on to Joseph Gus, page is a little difficult here. According to his death certificate, Joseph Gus died from nephritis, which was kidney disease, and pleurisy, or a lung infection. He died at the St. John General Hospital on July the 21st, 1941, and was buried later that same day. The newspaper reported that he had been ill for a couple of years, but had died after only a one-day stay in the hospital. And the account of his death in the newspaper in the Telegraph Journal went on to say, Mr. Gus played a leading role in the activities of the local Jewish community. He was president of St. John Young Judea and also of Maritime Young Judea, was the secretary of the Ezra Lodge Zionist Order of Habanim, and national vice president of Young Judea. And he had held office in the St. John YMHA. He was employed for a few years on the advertising staff of the Telegraph Journal and the Evening Times Globe. Besides his parents, Morris and Celia Gus of 4 Summer Street, he was survived by his wife, the former Miss Ruth Berman of Sackville, one sister, Ida Sarah Gus, became Mrs. Max Franzblow, and his 4 brothers, Ben Gus, William Gus, Abe Gus, and Jack Gus. At the time, Jack Gus was already enlisted in the Army and was home on leave. Chief Jess Baxter, president of the Provincial Council of the Boy Scouts Association, paid tribute today to the devotion of Joseph Gus to the Scout movement. It was with great regret and a deep sense of personal loss that I learned of the death of Mr. Gus, said his lordship. It was the life of scouting, and scouting was life to him. No task was ever given him that he did not accept joyfully and eagerly, nor was it necessary to get tasks for him. He found them for himself. Many a time when full of health and energy, he came into my office. He brought suggestions for things to be done and volunteered to do them. When his health broke down, we all thought that his wonderful physique would soon restore him. But as the months passed by, we had our doubts. At last, it looked as if he were to enjoy his work and we were to enjoy his doing it. But it was not to be, and now he must be counted among our remembrances. To his wife and family, there will be sympathy from all scouts far and near. There will be no Gilwell camp for a long time at which there will not be noticed a vacant place which only Joe could fill. But his spirit, transcending race and creed, abides us in the great brotherhood of those who endeavor in the service of humanity and to be helpful to those in need. So Mr. Gus, who took a prominent part in scouting leadership for a number of years, had only recently finished a period of convalescence from serious illness, which had sidelined him for 2 years. So he had started with the scouting movement in 1924 when the Young Judean, or 13th St. John Scout Troop, was organized. He was the assistant scoutmaster for the troop, and then assistant and provincial secretary and assistant district commissioner. He was on the headquarters staff of the Maritime Gilwell Scout Camp for a number of years, and he had been in contact with thousands of Boy Scouts throughout the province. He was also a student at St. Joseph's University when it held its classes and had become a member of the St. Patrick's Society. He had also found time to work as an insurance salesman and was the Boy Scout chairman of the Law School Debating Committee and secretary of the Playgrounds Association, and was also secretary of the St. John branch of the League of Nations Society. So a very busy person taken far too soon. Rose Davis died of meningitis on May the 6th, 1939. So she's seen here with her brothers, Izzy, Sam, Eli, and Abe. And she actually died at the Montreal Jewish General Hospital. And she had gone with her mother to Montreal for medical treatment. But on the day they were to return home, she was taken ill with meningitis and did not survive. She was a graduate of the St. John High School class of 1929. And the newspaper says she was beloved for her bright and cheerful disposition. She was a valued member of the St. John Junior Hadassah and a prime mover in all affairs which had a charitable purpose. Harry Begg is another interesting story that received a lot of newspaper coverage. And he died by suicide. And there was a lot of speculation over what had happened with him. And his story captured newspaper headlines in the St. John Globe, the Daily Telegraph, and in the Moncton Transcript from November 1st to 4th, 1910. And then there was a follow-up story on November the 15th. So the first story appeared in the St. John Globe on Tuesday, November 1st, 1910, under the headline, Harry J. Begg, a suicide at Moncton, arrested for strange conduct on train, hanged himself in lockup. Begg had boarded the night express train in Amherst bound for St. John, but was arrested in Moncton by that city's police at around 3 a.m. for causing a disturbance on board the train by cutting up the leather seats with a knife. The trouble started after Mr. Begg got off the train in Sackville during the stop and then reboarded. Police removed $97.67 and a flask of whiskey from his pockets when he was placed in the cell. And about 90 minutes after he was locked up, he was found hanging from a rope when the night guard was doing his rounds. The newspaper account said St. John friends of the unfortunate man were greatly shocked to hear of his suicide. It is said he was temperate, but that he had been acting strangely for a month or more. He leaves a wife and 6 children living on Pond Street. So he was employed as a junk dealer, and he was about 35 years of age. So Coroner Purdy and a jury of local men headed up the inquest. They questioned the members of the train crew, city police officers, prisoners in the adjacent cells, and Harry Begg's 2 brothers. The questions focused on Begg's behavior, his access to the rope that was used. Although he was not known by his family to be a drinker, he appeared drunk when he was arrested, although the train men described him as quote unquote crazy. The officers at the police station were unable to uncover where the rope had come from. Other prisoners had used a short length of rope as a clothesline, and it had been used in different cells in the days leading up to Begg's death. The rope itself did not appear to match any rope on the train or from the Begg store in Amherst. Similar rope had been present in the police station, but the rope seemed to have disappeared before Begg was brought in. The final jury verdict was that, quote, Harry Begg came to his death by hanging himself by the neck with a rope in cell number 4 in the police station at Moncton on the morning of November 1st, 1910, while his mind was deranged. So, quite a sad story there. These are a couple of men who I think I have them both here. Barney Zeberman, whose gravestone is pictured at the left, died on the 23rd of November, 1918, and was a victim of the Spanish flu. His second wife is Bella Zeberman. He'd had a first wife before he immigrated to Canada, so he had 12 children altogether, 7 with his first wife, 6 with the second, including 4 sons, Frank, Eli, Sam, and Harry, and then the 8 daughters, which included Bertha Levine, who I mentioned earlier. And so that was his story. So the one victim we know of who had the Spanish flu, which of course was a big concern after the First World War. And Max Zatzman, whose stone can be seen at the right, was 75 years of age when he died. He had been injured after being hit by a car on Mill Street at about 9 p.m. on November 21st, 1923. The driver of the car was identified as Fred McNamara, and Mr. Zatzman died the following morning from his injuries, which included a broken leg and broken ribs. And there was an inquest held into that as well. Just to make sure that it was only an accident. Our second murder victim, it took me a long time to find this story because I've known about Nathan Kaplan since the museum opened in 1986, and all we had was a notation, very brief, that he had been murdered. And I knew there had to be a story. So Nathan Kaplan was murdered in the tiny village of Clark's Harbor near Yarmouth, Nova Scotia on October 7th, 1901. And Clark's Harbor was a small fishing village with a population of about 1,300 people. Nathan Kaplan had been in Canada for about 3 years. His family included a wife and 7 children, all of whom were still in Russia, except for one 15-year-old son who was in Yarmouth with him, a brother Isaac Kaplan, who had a store in Yarmouth, and a nephew, Israel H. Kaplan, who had a store in St. John. Nathan Kaplan's body was found in his store between 8 and 8:30 p.m. by another Jewish man, Max Schneerson, who was later detained by the authorities as a witness. And the body was found with a shot in the head just behind the ear. The investigation started with a 2-day inquest, and it was followed by the arrest and trial of Julius Rill, who was 16 years old. And to all accounts in the newspaper, Kaplan was described as being well-liked and without enemies. The brother Isaac and the nephew Israel brought Nathan Kaplan's body back to St. John for burial, and there was a dramatic account of the funeral procession in the newspaper. And the story noted that there were a number of carriages that met the ferry on its arrival, and the conversation was undertaken, quote, in a language strange to the passerby. And the funeral itself took place within the cemetery grounds. So clearly the reporter had no knowledge of Hebrew or of Yiddish. As for Julius Rill, he was a young Jewish man who had been staying at the Seaview Hotel next to the Kaplan shop in Clark's Harbor. He had passed by the store shortly before the murder happened, and in a conversation with Max Schneerson expressed some concerns at the findings of the inquest. A witness at the inquest, a young woman working in the hotel, reported that she had found a gun cartridge in Rill's room. There were also gun cartridges in a trunk Rill had in storage at the Kaplan store. Julius Rill was arrested and charged with murder on October the 11th. His lawyers were Mr. Curry of St. John and S.W. Jacobs of Montreal. And I looked up S.W. Jacobs and discovered he was one of the first Jewish lawyers in Canada and was often called on to represent other Jews in civil and criminal matters. He also took on cases to fight against anti-Semitism and to support rights of Jews to obtain education and to practice Judaism. He was also the founder of the Jewish Times, a popular Jewish newspaper, and he served as an MP for Montreal from 1917 to 1938, and clearly popular since he ran and won 5 times. So the revolver that had been used in the murder was found by the coroner under a stable, and there were rumors that Rill had purchased it not long before. Rill did have ties to the Jewish community in Montreal, and his sister was married to another member of the Kaplan family living in St. John. And the newspaper suggested that Rill was trying to form a partnership with Kaplan. The preliminary court proceedings began on October the 23rd. Rill was linked to the purchase of a revolver and cartridges in Yarmouth, and this was the same gun that was found under the stable in Clark's Harbor, near the crime scene. So the jury at the preliminary hearing believed there was enough evidence to carry forward with the murder trial. So the trial followed on the 18th of June in 1902, and the evidence suggested that the motive for the murder was related to the theft of money from Kaplan, which was intended to be delivered to Isaac Kaplan in Yarmouth and to be put toward the costs of bringing Nathan Kaplan's family from Russia. The Crown presented a number of witnesses, investigators for its side, and the defense again presented no witnesses. In the closing arguments, Mr. Curry refuted every bit of evidence that was put forward and argued that the Crown had not made its case. Rill was found not guilty by the jury at the end of the trial's second day. However, these are my thoughts, but based on the newspaper accounts, everything seemed to point to Rill as the murderer. So, did he get away with it? I wonder. This is another story that probably nobody knows, and this is a story of Friedel Schiffman, and perhaps one of the saddest cases in this story. So the Schiffman family was living in Vienna at the time the Nazis came to power in 1938, and the family made the decision to leave. The daughter, Stella, was already trained as a doctor and engaged to be married to Dr. Paul Sommerfreund. They were able to escape to the relative safety of China in October 1938, and they married there on December the 2nd. The parents, Ira and Dora Schiffman, left for Shanghai on March the 5th, 1939, and remained there with their daughter for the duration of the war, and ended up in a ghetto in Shanghai during that time. The son, Friedel, was sent to England on the Kinder transport on the 10th of December 1938 at the age of 15. He was registered as an enemy alien in England on June the 21st, 1939, and then interned in May 1940, as the English government were rounding up all German nationals resident in the country out of concerns that they could have been spies or fifth columnists. And Friedel was among those who were interned and sent to the internment camps in Canada. He spent almost a year behind barbed wire in the internment camp in Ripples, New Brunswick, and so until the age of 18. And in a book published about the camp, it was noted that he was teaching English to his fellow prisoners and that he was able to speak 7 languages and play the piano. In 1941, he was transferred to Camp I at Île-aux-Noix in Quebec. And he was from there sponsored by Hyman and Molly Robinson of Montreal. And this allowed him to leave the camp for university. And they paid $1,000 to sponsor him. So he finished high school in November of 1942 and then went on to McGill University, where he graduated in 1945 with a first-class honors degree in zoology, a Bachelor of Science, and then began his master's degree that October. And he was assigned to field work in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, of what we now know as the Huntsman Laboratory. He did not go back to university to finish his degree. So Friedel completed what needed to be done to become a Canadian citizen on March the 8th, 1945. And then throughout the war and after the war, he tried to maintain a correspondence with his family. All of the letters were funneled through Jewish agencies. So as you can imagine, it took a while. And he attempted to obtain visas to bring his family to Canada and to find the money to pay for the passage. It was quite a challenge and expected to take well over a year to complete the process. While all of this was going on, his mother, Doris Schiffman, died on the 5th of April, 1946. Ira Schiffman arrived in Canada on the 18th of September, 1947, and settled in Montreal. His daughter, Stella, and son-in-law, Paul, and their 2 children arrived in November, 1948. Sadly, however, Friedel had already died by suicide, of either an overdose of pills or by taking poison. And he had done this in St. Andrews on the 16th of October, 1946. In the last letter he wrote to his family, he noted that he was looking forward to seeing his father and that he was doing well. But he died a year before his family was able to make it to Canada. Rachel Rozovsky was another accident victim, and she was hit by a car on December the 14th, 1944, and died of her injuries 2 days later. So she was at that time 86 years old. Doesn't say what street the accident took place on, but of course there was an inquest into her death, which was held in the courthouse, was led by Dr. C.L. Emerson, the coroner, and it began at 8:15 in the evening. At the time of the accident, it was reported that Mrs. Rozovsky had stepped out from between two parked cars on Main Street and was struck by a car driven by Anthony Henry of 12 Summer Street in West St. John, just as he was pulling away from the curb. Sadly, she was on her way to a birthday party for one of her grandchildren. She had been in St. John.
I have it on here.
Oh.
I'm watching it here.
What?
I'm watching it on my computer.
You're watching this?
Yes.
Terry, can you mute yourself, please?
Getting over?
Yes.
Terry, can you please mute yourself?
Sorry, dear.
So Mrs. Rozovsky had lived in St. John for 32 years before her death, and she was a member of the Daughters of Israel and of Hadassah. Her daughters were Mrs. Israel Elman and Mrs. Harry Davis, and she had 4 sons, Nathan, Abraham, Louis, and Miguel. So one of her sons had ended up in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And the Rozovsky family had been living on Spring Street in the city's north end. Esther Goldberg also died young on the 29th of June, 1935, and it was a sudden death. So they had been living in the city for about 5 years after coming from Poland. Abe Goldberg had been working as a tailor and would later go on working for other people, but would later go on to have his own tailor shops. And he would remarry. So at the time of her death, she did have 1 son. And when Abe Goldberg remarried, he had another child, a daughter. This is another interesting story. And this was a fun, kind of an odd way of piecing it together. This man was buried in St. John in 1938, but was not from St. John. And it was probably about 10 years ago or more that I heard from a family that were searching for him. His family were trying to find his grave. And there were he had 12 grandchildren, and they had always wondered what had happened to Bernard Hart or Bernard Herskowitz. And they knew that he had drowned somewhere, and they thought he had drowned in Newfoundland. And it was only through a chance encounter at a London theater in August 2008 that helped them unravel the circumstances of the death and where his grave was. And she was discussing with another theater patron family history and where people were buried. And he had connections to Halifax and said that this person had nothing to do with their community. So they went off searching in St. John's, Newfoundland, which, as you can imagine, growing up in St. John was not an unheard of complication. And so she reached out to St. John's, Newfoundland, and had no luck until she started out with, she did find something. And of course, there was a misprint in the newspaper. And then when they went looking in St. John's, they could not find him in those records. And the suggestion was made by the folks in Newfoundland that maybe it was St. John, New Brunswick that they were looking for. And of course, she called, and it took me about, a minute and a half to find the information that she was looking for from the St. John newspaper from the 11th of April, 1938. The victim of last night's accident in the harbor has been identified as Bernard H. Herskowitz, interpreter aboard the CPS Montrose, which docked at berth 2 at 9:50 o'clock last night. It was stated by Detective Kilpatrick, who had carried on the investigation of the case since the incident occurred. Also known by the name of M.V. Hart, the man received permission to go ashore for the night after the ship had been tied up at the berth. And it is the theory of the police that Herskowitz stumbled while racing along berth 3 to catch the ferry boat, which was to make its last trip from the west side at 10:15. He lost his balance, it is believed, and plunged into the icy waters of the harbor. That section of the waterfront has been in almost complete darkness, and a strong wind of near hurricane proportions was blowing unchecked along the harbor edge. His cries for help were heard by Mark Corkum, an engineer aboard the nearby towboat, Comacan. Corkum plunged into the frigid waters almost immediately, having secured a tow rope around him, found the drowning man, fastened the rope around his waist, and brought him to the side of a barge floating off berth 3. Where fellow workers assisted in pulling the now unconscious burden to the ice-covered deck. The victim died on the barge a few minutes later. So the family went on to do some additional research and discovered that in 1911, he was listed as a market draper, and the family was comfortable enough to employ a maid. But after that, circumstances changed. They became a poor family, were reduced to buying just the bruised fruit from the market at the end of the day. And then Bernard had become a steward on a ship sailing from Liverpool to New York City, and had been promoted by 1931 to ship's interpreter. So he went to sea to ensure regular income. And at the time of his death, Bernard stayed in lodgings when on leave rather than in the family home. So it appears that perhaps his wife and children had kicked him out. And even though he died in 1938, you can see the gravestone is quite new. So this stone was placed, I think, somewhere around about 2008, 2009 in the cemetery to mark what had been an unmarked grave. This is the last of the 3 murder victims in the cemetery. So this is Annie Flam, and she was a shopkeeper in Chatham. She was one of the victims of Alan Legier. So anybody who was following New Brunswick news in 1989 knew about Alan Legier. He had already been convicted for murder, had gone to hospital for some sort of medical attention, had escaped his guards, and was more or less at loose through the province of New Brunswick for a number of months following his escape. It was an anxious time for everybody because nobody knew where he was. Nobody went out after dark. You were very conscious of checking your car before you got inside it, all that kind of thing. But he did return to the Miramichi, and he did commit 4 murders within a relatively short period of time, and Annie Flam was one of his victims. The first newspaper report was very short, just noting a fire in the shop and that she had died. So the first report would have been May 31, 1989. And the headline, Mounties say little about Chatham fire. So you think perhaps the story might have more in that direction. But as it turned out, the fire was set up to cover the break-in and an assault on 2 women. So Annie Flam and her sister-in-law, Nina Flam. And they lived in a flat above the little grocery store they operated in Chatham, New Brunswick. And of course, once Alan Legier was caught, there was extensive coverage of the murder case, and he's still locked up. He's in a prison somewhere in Western Canada. Nina Flam was also injured in that incident. She did recover from her injuries, and she lived until January of 2015. Her husband, Bernard Flam, had actually served as the mayor of Chatham for a brief period, I think in the 1950s or 60s. Can't remember quite the exact year. Here are 2 other early graves. Louis Goldfeather, who died in October of 1918. And the Daily Telegraph on the October 4th of that year wrote this story that many friends will regret to learn of the death of Louis Goldfeather, the eldest son of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Goldfeather and Esther Poyas Goldfeather, 158 Prince William Street, which occurred on Tuesday night at the General Public Hospital after a short illness following an operation. Besides his parents, 1 brother, Bernie Goldfeather, and three sisters, Clara Bernstein, Faye Yampole, and I can't pull the other name out of my head, but did have three. Oh, and Rose Kornblatt was the third one. So his niece would have been Erminie Cohen. And the death certificate that is on file at the Provincial Archives indicated that Louis Goldfeather had been ill for about a month. His memory does live on today in the Sharazadic Synagogue. One of the Torah scrolls in the Holy Ark was donated to the congregation by his mother, and she has saved the money to purchase this by saving the money she ran for the boarding house in her home. So a boarding house for new arrivals into the city. And a few years ago, her great-granddaughter from Chicago, Lanny Yampole Gershon, purchased a new cloth cover for that Torah scroll, giving some of the scroll's history. And I think the Goldfeather name is also engraved on the wooden rollers that go around it. Joseph Brager, who was buried right beside Louis Goldfeather, also died of the Spanish flu. So this was a second victim of the Spanish flu in 1918. And the headline read, Joseph Brager dies of Spanish grip. The death of Joseph Brager occurred on Saturday, October the 12th, 1918, at the residence of his parents, 343 Union Street, after a brief illness. About a week ago, he contracted a severe cold, which developed into influenza and pneumonia. Besides his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Louis Brager, he leaves two brothers and two sisters all at home to mourn their loss. And Joseph Brager was only 26 years old at the time that he died. And I think this might be, not sure if this is the last one or not. I guess there's a few more still, maybe. Dr. Frank Boyaner. He turns up in a lot of these walks because, of course, the Boyaners were a fairly prominent family in the community. The grave marker that you see here is in the Sharazadic Cemetery, but Frank Boyaner is actually buried in Brookwood Military Cemetery in England. And he had died in Brighton, England on the 9th of January, 1945 of an infection, which he had contracted while serving in Italy with the army during the Second World War. He was in the dental corps. And at the time of his death, they were actually planning to send him home after all of his years of overseas service. And he was, at the time of his death, 47 years old. He had, before the war, established a dental practice in the city, first on Germain Street and then to King Street. He joined the non-permanent active militia well before the declaration of the Second World War and was a lieutenant in the Canadian Army Dental Corps by the outbreak of war. He was the dental officer for Military District 7, which included St. John, and also for the 14th Field Ambulance, which was also headquartered in St. John under the leadership of Dr. Joseph Tansman. Frank Boyaner went overseas in 1941, was posted in England, and then was out with the Dental Corps to Malta, and then up through Sicily and through Italy, so through that Italian campaign. And throughout the war, he sent postcards back to his nephew in St. John, to Dan Ellman, and he focused on things of interest to 10-year-old boys, so a lot of pictures and stories about airplanes and aircraft and that sort of thing, rather than his actual war experiences. And Lyle Isaacs, who I'm sure everybody here remembers, he's buried in the Greenheart Cemetery, and sort of at the back, again, under the trees. And the headline in the Evening Times Globe on October 13th, 1970, was headlined, "Car Crash Claims Local Youth." Lyle Abraham Isaacs, 20, a second-year high honors student at York University in Toronto, and an active participant in the local Jewish community, was killed Wednesday in an automobile accident near Huntsville, Ontario, 160 miles north of Toronto. Police report that his car collided with a tractor trailer on a highway near Huntsville. At the time of his death, Mr. Isaacs was program director at Camp Bilben, a national leadership training institute for Canadian Young Judea. In 1968, Mr. Isaacs graduated in second place with high honors from St. John High School and was named Outstanding Student of the Year. He was president of the high school student council and helped to introduce a foster parent plan to the school. Previous to that, he was president of the Prince Charles School Student Council and won an outstanding student award at that school. In 1968 to 69, he spent 1 year in a leadership training program in Israel and was elected national president of the Canadian Young Judea. He was serving his second term in that position at the time of his death. In May 1970, he returned to Israel on behalf of Young Judea to find a program director for the central region of the Zionist Youth Movement. He was the son of Lawrence and Ruth Shane Isaacs of 21 Orange Street. Besides his parents, he is survived by one sister, Mrs. Avi Ram of Israel, or as you would probably have known her as Leslie. And in the funeral notice that followed a couple of days later, it said that members of the Young Judea acted as pallbearers. And memorial tributes were made to the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation and to the Lyle Isaacs Memorial Scholarship Fund for Perpetual Student Aid at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And these are two accidental deaths. Son and mother. So Kevin Fallon was killed while riding his motorcycle with a friend, and he was only 17 years old. And this accident happened on the highway near Westfield on the 30th of April, 1988. And he and his friend were riding the bike across the highway into the path of a truck. And it was reported to be foggy and raining at the time of the accident. And the boys presumably lost control of the machine. Kevin Fallon had been a student at St. John High School, but had been born in Truro, Nova Scotia, and was the son of John and Tammy Ross Fallon, and had a sister, Robin. So most of the Ross family still lives in the Truro area. And 3 years after his death, his mother would die in a skiing accident at Crab Mountain near Fredericton. And she died on the 23rd of March, 1991. And she was described as an experienced skier who was simply a victim of bad luck. When she was skiing, she struck a tree on one of the hills trails on a Saturday afternoon. And it had been the first death in the 20-year history of the Crab Mountain Park. So at that time, the park was about 20 years old, and she was the first person who had died there. It was the Tippy Canoe Trail. So it was an advanced slope on the far side of the mountain. And the weather was described as clear, and the slope conditions were good at the time of the accident. So she was a season pass holder, had been skiing there for most of the hill's history. But the accident happened when she turned down a side trail and with another skier. And when they bumped into each other, it was Tammy Fallon who ended up going into the tree. She had been a school teacher in the city, and she was teaching grade 4 at Glen Falls Elementary School at the time she died. I think she had also taught at Island View School on the west side of the city. So I know this was kind of a sad walk, wandering through the cemetery, stopping at spots where people left us before their time. But if you have comments, suggestions, and memories you would like to share, I'll have a chance to do that in just a minute. So we've gotten through almost all of the walks at this point. So the last walk in the series is going to be on Wednesday, April the 19th, and we're going to take a walk along Summer Street, where almost every house had a Jewish family in it. I have the outline for the walk. I have the names. I just have to fill in all the bits and pieces to make the walk interesting. And the other walks that we've done on Orange Street, King Street East, Leinster Street, Elliott Row, and the other two walks in the cemetery with the veterans and the merchants, I'm going to try and get those edited sometime in the next month or so and put those up on our YouTube channel, and then do the same thing with Summer Street. There's a gap before the next walk because of Passover. I was going to do it next Wednesday, but I'm figuring most of you might be busy searching for that last piece of leavened bread and making sure that the matzah hasn't broken and preparing for dinner. So I figured I'd best let you do that. And then the next Wednesday wasn't much better. So April the 19th it is. You can bring your leftover matzah though, it's okay. And then just a reminder that I'm still putting together things for our bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah exhibit. So if you still have things that you would like to share, your memories, invitations, photographs, and memorabilia, like to have it soon. I'm going to start trying to put everything together. I tried to do that this morning, didn't quite get there, but Wednesdays are a busy day, as you know.